So, Shadowlands is a thing that exists. I don't think I'm breaking any new ground in stating the most recent story direction has been, pretty bad. And while I'm not here to just rag on Blizzard's writers, I am left wondering, what the hell happened? Like, how did we even get here? While diving down this rabbit hole, I found myself digging through years of lore to pinpoint the exact moment where the story went off the deep end. While I do have pages upon pages of notes from the last 3 or so expansions that have slowly built up the budget Thanos we've all come to hate, I don't feel like that by itself would be as interesting of a video. There's literally dozens, if not hundreds, of videos out there dissecting the Shadowlands lore, to the point where I don't really feel like there's anything left to add. However, I do think there's an important discussion to be had here. It's so easy to just sit here and say Shadowlands bad. I'd be right, but I don't think that furthers the discussion at all. What I'd like to do instead is actually give examples of how the story could have gone better, where it could have been improved, where it went well, and where the story beats could have been adjusted to make everything flow just a little bit better. Now, I'd like to point out the obvious. I'm not a professional writer, not even close. The point of this video is not to say that I could have done it better than Blizzard, which is kind of ironic given the title of this video. Regardless, this is coming from the perspective of a fan. Admittedly a fan who's read well over a dozen of the official novels and has been playing the game for, almost 13 years. God, I feel old. Anyways, my point here is that everything I say is coming from a place of love and admiration for the world Blizzard has built, and while I will be starting from the very beginning of the World of Warcraft timeline to build upon the points I'll make later on, I'm going to avoid messing with the story from the original Warcraft RPGs. Technically, I could go further back, but I had to draw the line somewhere, and I feel like this is a good place to start. So without drawing this out anymore, let's dive straight into it. I know I just went through this whole spiel about how we're going to clean up the timeline, but in all honesty I think vanilla is fine as is. The beginning of the game was really just meant to let you explore the world of Azeroth like never before, slowly opening up new dungeons and raids to become more acquainted with your surroundings. In that sense, I feel like vanilla did a good job. It didn't need to have any grand overarching storyline yet, it just needed to keep giving us a new carrot on a stick to chase every once in a while. If any of you have ever watched my old dungeon overview series for the Burning Crusade, you'll know I was more than a little harsh on these old dungeons. In terms of raw gameplay, the dungeons themselves are pretty bare bones and haven't aged well in the years since their release. That being said, while this is definitely one of my least favorite expansions, I gotta admit, the story is pretty solid, or at least the potential of it is. If we adjust the order in which things happen and change the context just a little bit, the Burning Crusade can actually have a really clean storyline. You have to remember that the main quest progression has us coming to Outland as adventurers, fresh off defeating random one-off threats like Ragnaros and Onyxia. There's not a ton of story development leading up to most of the content in vanilla, it's just go to this area and defeat this enemy, for no real reason outside of wanting better loot. This was the first time Blizzard tried to weave a story throughout an entire expansion, and while I think they got the gist of it down, it could have made a bit more sense by changing the order of operations. Technically, the story of the Burning Crusade has Gruul the Dragon Slayer teaming up with Illidan, though that plot point doesn't entirely make sense, and it doesn't exist outside of like 1 or 2 lines of quest dialogue. To me, it would make more sense if Gruul wasn't aligned with anyone, and was just a chaotic force of nature that fights anyone that comes into his territory. It still makes sense for us to fight him because big monster equals good loot, and when have we ever needed more of a reason than that? But seriously, we don't need a ton of justification other than wanting to set up a base of operations in Blade's Edge, and Gruul's forces are making that difficult for us. The same goes for the Alkindune dungeon hub as well. It doesn't cleanly fit into the other areas of the lore for Outland, and I feel like there's a ton of room to let it be its own thing towards the beginning of the expansion. Again, the justification can be as simple as the dark forces within are threatening our foothold on Shattrath, and we need to clear out this threat before worrying about anything else. I like to call this step in the lore progression the natural forces of Outland. From there we can start to dismantle the Naga and the Hellfire Orcs, because they're more or less the first line of defense for Illidan. We take them out and he's not left with a ton of other forces outside of the few demon hunters he's trained and whatever demons he's convinced to betray the Burning Legion. Quick side note about Hellfire Citadel in particular, I think it would work a lot better to have the Shattered Halls dungeon be a part of the raid instead. Kargath Bladefist is a legendary character, and honestly deserved better than to be a simple dungeon boss. Imagine going through the Shattered Halls raid only to have Magtheridon be the secret final boss after Kargath. I feel like that would have been a legendary moment in the game's history. After we've dealt with the bulk of Illidan's allies, there's technically only the Blood Elf defectors on his side, though by this point the story quests should reveal that Kael'thas has already betrayed Illidan for the Legion, so now it's just Illidan that we have to worry about. We storm the Black Temple and take him out like normal, except this time there should be more emphasis on him being captured as opposed to dying, so we can set up that storyline better for Legion further down the line. Once Illidan is out of the way, of course our next threat, and the final one on Outland itself, is Kael'thas. Everything pretty much goes the same as we know it for this. We storm the raid, fail to get the goddamn mount to drop, and defeat the Fallen Prince. Now here's where my changes to the story really start to become significant. One of the main complaints about Shadowlands in particular is that none of it feels like it relates back to Azeroth. You know, the World of Warcraft itself. So when thinking back to the Burning Crusade, I wanted to make sure there was a reason to bring everything back from Outland. In this version of events, just as we're defeating Kael'thas, the Legion makes their move back on Azeroth. Specifically, they assault the Tower of Karazhan and the Sunwell Plateau at the same time. The Amani trolls then notice Silvermoon City is having trouble with the demons and decide it's a perfect time to make their move as well. This gives us an actual reason to come back home, and it fits with what already happens in-game. As we return to push the Legion's advancements back, we reach a stalemate with the demons just as we reach the Sunwell itself. We've reached the limit of how far our skills will carry us, and we need more preparation to face the demons. Wanting to help us, the Bronze Dragonflight opens the Caverns of Time for training purposes. After completing their dungeons, we receive word that the Legion is trying to bring Kil'jaeden himself into the world. Nosdormu knows we're not ready to face an officer of the Burning Legion quite yet, so they send us to the Battle of Mount Hyjal raid in order to gain experience against the memory of Archimonde. After all our training, we're ready to take ground in the Isle of Quel'Danas. We start with the Magister's Terrace, taking out Kael'thas one last time before moving into the raid and preventing the Legion's ritual from fully summoning Kil'jaeden. We may not have beaten him at even a fraction of his full strength, but this is the first time we've ever faced an opponent of that caliber in our character's lifespan. Now, I do want to put your fears to rest. I'm not going to go through every single expansion like I just did for the Burning Crusade. For more than just satiating my non-existent OCD, I wanted to use this as an example of how I'll be approaching any changes to the story moving forward. I'm going to stick to just moving things around for the content we've already received, occasionally removing plot points that don't work, and at most adding official content that was cut before it could be released. I'll be honest, I got basically nothing for this one. Why mess with perfection? That being said, there is one thing I'd like to see slightly more focus on, and that's the fact that Dranosh Sourfang was the prime candidate for Warchief once Thrall retired. It was between him and Garrosh, and Dranosh was definitely the more mature and capable leader out of the two. This is at least part of the reason why some among the Horde found it so hard to support Garrosh's ascension to Warchief, and I think it would add more depth if the loss of the younger Sourfang was more front-facing. For the most part, I think the main storyline of Cataclysm can remain the same. There's not enough major plot holes to go around changing things. Despite some people back in the day being disappointed with Deathwing's boss fight, it is rather accurate to how the lore described him, so overall it's fine as is. The one major thing I'd like to add is the Neptulon raid that was supposed to come out at the same time as Firelands. They scrapped it, and I believe they ended up using some of the assets later on for Najdatar and BFA, but I think it fits just as well before the Firelands in the timeline. Instead of going through the whole ordeal with the Cenarian Circle, I think it would make more sense to free the Elemental Lord of Water in order to gain his blessing and protection in the Firelands. It also feels a lot better than the off-screen closure we actually got for Neptulon at the beginning of Legion during the Shaman campaign. One last piece I'd like to add on to Cataclysm would be more character development for Garrosh. At the end of Wrath, we adjusted the context to his entry to the Mantle of Warchief, but throughout Cataclysm, Garrosh never really did much. He had that one scene in the Stone Talon questline that was pretty good, but otherwise he just kind of existed in this awkward limbo, with most of Thrall's advisors refusing to work with him. I'd like to see more of these struggles and their aftermath addressed in the game itself. We should see Garrosh make rookie mistakes as a warrior forced into a politician's shoes. He's used to carving enemies with his axe, not posturing with other faction leaders. There's small hints of it at different points of questing with the Horde, but it's never really explored too deeply. Cataclysm should end with at least some feeling that the new Warchief has learned how to lead, even if it leads to him learning the wrong lessons at the end of it all. Despite what a lot of people say, I genuinely loved Pandaria's story. There's definitely a few small tweaks to be made here and there, but for the most part, this was a great way for Blizzard to introduce a completely new storyline into the mix. First things first, I think the entire context of the Horde versus Alliance conflict in Pandaria needs to be flipped on its head. If you'll remember, a ship carrying Anduin crashes off the coast of the Jade Forest, and both factions then team up with the locals for safety. The Alliance quest is framed around the idea of saving Anduin and preventing the Horde from doing anything dumb, but the Horde quest is painted entirely in the light of conquest.
I am pleased to report that the battle at sea goes well, War Chief. Our forces report decisive victories off the coasts of Daenerys and Tol Barad.
Alliance blood spills. This pleases me, General.
There's more. I received word that our southern fleet engaged an Alliance envoy. We chased the royal flagship until it ran aground.
Aground? Where?
Apparently, they found a massive, uncharted landmass, shrouded by dense mists.
And you let the Alliance get there first! Redirect the invasion fleet! General, you and your best veterans will pave our way, storm the shore, and paint this new continent red!
As someone who was primarily Alliance when I still played, can we for once have the Alliance be morally gray? Like, I get that the Horde were the bad guys in the First and Second Great Wars back in the Warcraft games, but this isn't the old Horde anymore. It's okay to add a little depth to their story. They're complex people with complex problems. The entire common theme among every Horde race is the lack of supplies. The vast majority of the Horde races live in arid or barren environments, and the few that don't, like the Blood Elves or the Tauren, suffer from magic addiction and a lack of manpower to stave off their enemies alone. This is a huge reason why Garrosh decided to assault Ashenvale in Cataclysm. The Horde needed lumber, and the Night Elves refused to sell them any. In direct contrast, the Alliance are considerably well off in terms of resources, and if anything, they struggle more with the intricate details of their modern societies. The Horde doesn't have that luxury, and honestly, I wish the Alliance had enough depth to allow themselves to play the villains every now and then. Imagine if the Horde came across Pandaria's shores first and went to look for trade deals with the natives to secure supplies they so desperately need. Not to conquer the people of Pandaria, but just to open supply routes so they can actually exist. From there, the Alliance goes to meet them because they believe the Horde is there to conquer, and then the conflict breaks out like normal. The end result can be the exact same, but once again, by changing the context just a little bit, the entire setup for Mists feels more human, in a way. The Alliance obviously have a stranglehold on the vast majority of natural resources in the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor. Northrend is a frozen wasteland, and Outland is the dying remains of Draenor. Pandaria is the first new land with actual resources we've come across, so it only makes sense that the Horde wants to avoid collapsing. The normal questing experience for the expansion can play out roughly the same from there. The story progresses reasonably well for the most part. The major thing I would like to change, however, is Garrosh himself. Once he steps foot on Pandaria, that should be seen as a massive turning point in the entire story's direction. I don't like the idea of having him fall completely victim to the heart of Y'Shaarj. He's too stubborn for that, but I think it is okay to have him slowly fall victim to his own pride. The heart can egg him on, but the emphasis needs to be put on the fact that he's still calling the shots at all times. Over the course of the expansion, from Landfall onwards, Garrosh needs to gradually be making more and more rash decisions, escalating the faction war to the point where there's no turning back. This is a much better time to initiate events like the bombing of Theramore, as opposed to when it actually happens much earlier in the Mists/late Cata timeline. It gives a little more of a steady ramp in the tempo of the conflict until everything culminates in the Siege of Orgrimmar. Mists should end more or less the same as it did, with Garrosh's Iron Horde falling apart and everyone is left to pick up the pieces. I still like Vol'jin becoming the new War Chief, and I like Garrosh being put on trial in Pandaria. However, there's quite a few things I'd like to change about the events leading to the next expansion. Skip it. Skip the whole thing. Between you and me, I'm not entirely convinced this wasn't just a giant marketing ploy for the live-action movie that came out around the same time, which is kind of sad if you think about it, because they both flopped pretty hard. Regardless, I don't see why we can't go directly from Mists to Legion. So that's exactly what we're going to do. But, before we get there, there are very few things that are worth keeping from the alternate reality Draenor from the past. Seriously, who the hell thought that was a good concept? However, there is still the issue of Garrosh. If he doesn't set off the events that lead to Warlords, then what does he do? Well, if you ask me, he can still escape from his prison just by himself rather than with the help of Kairos Dormu. And if we're not going to win alternate reality Draenor, then where does Garrosh go? Draenor. Our Draenor, to be specific, or Outland, as is currently known. This cutscene right here is the only thing worth keeping in the entire expansion for Warlords of Draenor. It's such a beautiful culmination of everything to do with Garrosh's character, it's gotta stay. So instead of what actually happened, Garrosh is gonna travel to the real Nagrand where he and Thrall first met, just outside of Garadar, which is ironically very close to where the fight actually takes place in the alternate reality version. He doesn't know what he's doing or where he's going, but Garrosh knows he won't be standing trial in Pandaria. Thrall meets him to end this saga exactly where it began, back in the Burning Crusade. Not the glorious warrior's death Garrosh envisioned for himself, but in the end, he definitely pays for his crimes.
You made me what I am!
No. You chose your own destiny.
So, if it's not an alternate reality version of Gul'dan that opens the Tomb of Sargeras to kick off the events of Legion, who does? The answer? Some random demon. I don't know. Doesn't really matter. Pop quiz. What was the name of the demon that opened the Dark Portal to start the Burning Crusade expansion? If you guessed High Lord Cruel, you are exactly wrong. To be fair, you were close. It was Lord Kazak. Cruel was his lieutenant. Regardless, Kazak opened the Dark Portal but failed at keeping us out of Hellfire Peninsula. This was seen as a pretty big failure to the higher-ups of the Legion, so I think it could be pretty funny to send Kazak to open the tomb while we're off in Outland confronting Garrosh. As for the primary Legion storyline itself, I think it can remain mostly intact, though you'll notice this is where we're going to be changing a lot more compared to the older expansions. For starters, Vol'jin definitely shouldn't die. Keep in mind that because we're skipping straight from Mist to Legion, he wouldn't have been Warchief for more than like a couple of weeks, though I do think you can keep the part about him being impaled by a Legionnaire. He can be maimed, just not die. He's too good of a character that has more uses alive than dead. Having their leader broken and physically unable to fight can lead the Horde to the beginning of turning towards the council of leaders they currently have. It should be a slow process, however. Let the idea linger in the Horde that maybe they shouldn't have a solitary leader in charge of absolutely everything, as opposed to a more democratic council where every race can take part. There's also a quick side piece that's been bugging me for the longest time, and while it doesn't have any major story implications per se, it was my biggest pet peeve in the entire expansion, so I'm adding it in here. We should never have taken artifact weapons that were still in use. I get that it's cool to have these legendary arms at our disposal, but killing Tyrion Fordring just to have the Ashbringer was dumb. Like, really? Having a sacred orcish artifact like the Doomhammer in the hands of my dwarf shaman felt all kinds of wrong. It's okay to have these ancient artifacts with a lot of story behind them, but let's not steal them from the cold dead hands of our allies, okay? Anyways, personal gripe aside, I think there's one final piece to the Legion puzzle that needs to be addressed, specifically the plot thread revolving around Sylvanas. This is definitely the moment where Blizzard set the Shadowlands story in motion. I don't have any other way of saying this, so I'll just get to the point. Skip it. I think there is definitely a place for Shadowlands in the Jailer in the Warcraft timeline, but this just isn't it, at least not yet. For now, I think we should focus on the smaller aspects of Sylvanas' story. The big character development piece can be later down the line. That means for now, the Stormheim questline is going to revolve almost entirely around Sylvanas versus Greymane. This was unfortunately abandoned in recent times, but I personally would have liked to see some kind of more definitive conclusion between the Forsaken and Gilneas conflict. I don't know if we completely close that out in Stormheim, but I think developing it further would be for the better. This does beg the question of what to do with the parts where Sylvanas meets Helia to make some kind of bargain, but I think there's only minor contextual changes necessary to make it work. All we really need to do is have Greymane and Sylvanas accompany us to Helheim depending on which faction we're on, and they just wander off on their own during the main quests through the area. Greymane tries to track down Sylvanas, and the Banshee Queen investigates Helia's supposed ability to make more Valkyr. I don't think any bargain has to be struck between Helia and Sylvanas for now, at least. At most, Helia would try to tempt Sylvanas to her side, but nothing should actually come of it yet. Other than that, the Legion storyline can play out as it originally happened, despite being the starting point for one of the strangest and most critically panned plot threads in Warcraft's history. Legion itself was pretty damn solid. You remember all that reorganization we did in the Burning Crusade? Well, we're about to do that again, except on steroids. Buckle up, because this is going to be a long one. The burning of Teldrassil and the subsequent battle for Undercity are two of the most consequential events in modern-day Warcraft. They forever changed the Alliance and Horde, and I don't think the world has been given enough time to fully process and move on from their aftermath. Unfortunately, if you ask me, Blizzard messed up the order of operations. Let me walk you through my thought process. Anduin has gone through a lot by this point in the timeline, and is obviously struggling to live up to Varian's legacy. He leans heavily on the other racial leaders for guidance, something Tyrande and Greymane used to their advantage. I'm not even making this up. They're the ones shown to be at his side the most, advising him on how he should move against the Horde. In this version of events, we're going to have the battle for Undercity take place first. To get there, Greymane in particular is going to be the whisper in Anduin's ear to take back the ancestral lands of the Alliance. While he is reluctant, Anduin doesn't have the experience as king to maneuver these kinds of situations, and gives the go-ahead for a full-blown offensive on the Forsaken. The Alliance, for once, are the aggressors. The battle for Undercity obviously changes its tone entirely. Instead of this stalemate between factions, it's mostly just the Forsaken versus the entire Alliance. The Horde are aware, but they're frantically gathering their forces to assist Sylvanas and her people. The fighting rages on, and the perspective of the Horde should be desperation. They've always had to fight for their survival, but they never expected the Alliance to go this far. The Horde has never been on the receiving end before. Not like this. The Forsaken are slowly pushed back towards the bowels of their home, deeper into the underground quarters. The fighting makes its way to the Plague Quarters, where Sylvanas and her personal guard are surrounded. The Horde airships arrive just in time to start evacuating the Forsaken that flee the sewers, but they're having a tough time fighting their way to aid those still inside. In a last-ditch effort, Sylvanas blows up the Plague Quarters and makes an escape with whoever she can save. The Alliance are forced to retreat, but only some of their forces are able to avoid the gruesome death by the vile concoction they forced the Banshee Queen to unleash. Anduin must live with the hollow victory he allowed, while the Horde return to Orgrimmar to recollect themselves. All of a sudden, the entire script is flipped. Instead of being completely planned out by Sylvanas, it's an exacerbation of the faction war that's been building for years now. Tyrande has always been antagonistic towards the Horde, and Greymane, well, yeah. The Gilneans lost their city and their prince to the Forsaken, but at least in this version of events, those character motivations are allowed to play out in a way that feels more natural. Back in Orgrimmar, the Horde leaders are split about 50-50 with how to move forward. Sylvanas and a few others like Gallywix and Sourfang are ready to hit the Alliance right back, while the others are hesitant to start an all-out war after just working together to take down Sargeras. However, none of them think taking it all lying down is the right way, so they allow Sylvanas to lead a battalion of Horde soldiers towards Teldrassil, where they'll demand Tyrande and Greymane stand trial for war crimes. The burning of Teldrassil happens mostly the same as it did before. It's really just the context leading up to it that shifted. I'd say we skipped the part about Sylvanas resurrecting the Night Elf Sentinels. That kinda leads back into the Shadowlands and the Jailer, which we already said we're not doing right now. This should be as simple as the Horde versus the Alliance, where the big twist is that the Alliance are the ones in the moral gray this time. The burning itself should be a spur-of-the-moment thing from Sylvanas. The bulk of the Horde forces, including Sourfang, just wanted to bring the rogue Alliance leaders to justice, not cause a genocide of their own. Sylvanas herself should set off the flaming catapults, and we should see her physically struggle with the concept. The moment needs to be ingrained as one of internal strife. What it definitely shouldn't be is the moment Sylvanas becomes completely irredeemable as a character. Are her actions horrible? Absolutely. But is Sylvanas the only one at fault in this alternate scenario? Definitely not. Instead of becoming a monster hell-bent on ending all life on Azeroth, Sylvanas is someone who has to deal with the fact that she's no better than the people she sought to bring justice to. That, to me, feels more compelling than whatever the hell they did with her in Shadowlands. From there, the battle devolves into disorganized chaos as both factions retreat from the horrors in front of them. The Horde flees to Orgrimmar while the Alliance desperately tries to save everyone they can. I just want to point something out, by the way. After all of this, we're not even in the real start of Battle for Azeroth. This is just the introduction to set the tone for what comes next. Oh boy, what did I get myself into? Now that we've taken a break from the mutually assured destruction, we can get into the real meat of BFA. Nothing's going to be changed as drastically as what we just went through, but there are some adjustments here and there to keep everything moving along more smoothly. For starters, I don't really like the significance the plot has for the Heart of Azeroth. It's a cool artifact in terms of mechanics, but I'd rather just have it stay as a neat little trinket we get for healing the World Soul. I'll explain why as we move deeper through the expansion. For the most part, the reasons the factions seek out these Andalari and Kul-Tirans are pretty much unchanged. They both want more resources and bodies to throw at the other side in the coming war. Of course, the standard questing experience involves traveling through the lands to gain the trust of these new allies, but otherwise none of this really needs major changes. Uldir was honestly a great first raid, and it helps build weight behind the idea that there's bigger threats to deal with besides some petty faction war. The next major raid being the Battle of Dazara Lore, it can mostly stay the same as well. I like the build up to Rastakhan's death, and the story progression throughout was pretty solid. The one thing I'd like to see is another boss after Jaina. Make it some kind of Naga or old god monstrosity that comes out of the ocean. It doesn't have to be a significant character itself, it's just a plot device to open the way to Najdatar. It would act as a good turning point in the lore for the expansion, where we put the faction war on hold to finally focus on the bigger threat, which in this case is Azshara and N'Zoth. Najdatar was honestly a pretty good patch, so it can remain more or less unchanged. The one part I definitely want to change is the context surrounding the Azshara raid fight. I really didn't like the idea that the Heart of Azeroth was somehow the key to unlocking N'Zoth's prison. It felt like a plot MacGuffin more than anything else. Instead, I think it would be better if Azshara herself was the one keeping N'Zoth's prison intact. She is insanely strong and incredibly crafty, so it makes sense to have her be the one tending to the chains of the old god. While it may feel a little weird considering the Naga actively work with the Faceless Ones, this isn't really anything new. From the beginning, Azshara didn't really want to serve N'Zoth, but to work alongside this being of ancient power. Their alliance is tenuous at best, and it makes a lot of sense that she would want to keep N'Zoth's influence in check. Remember, she wants to run the show herself, and she's been doing that for literal millennia at this point. But of course, Azshara does fall to us, and we unwittingly free the old god, leading to the next major patch. First things first, Ny'alotha being an alternate dimension of Azeroth instead of a physical location was just dumb. This capital of the Black Empire has been hyped up for over a decade at this point. It really needs to be something that we can actually explore. I figure you can either place it on the Great Ocean on the long-fabled other side of Azeroth, or make the hole N'Zoth came out of some kind of opening to Ny'alotha itself. Either option could work, and I honestly don't have a preference between them. For the raid itself, the entire goal we're going for needs to shift. We can't kill N'Zoth, and we're definitely not doing that stupid-ass laser thing. That was the dumbest way to ever end the expansion, and... No, we're not doing this. We're just taking a 90-degree turn directly around that one. Instead, we're going to be working together with Wrathion to push N'Zoth back into containment using a prison we've built in the build-up to the raid itself. We already know we can't kill old gods, that causes more trouble in the long run than the old god itself. We imprison N'Zoth after a long, drawn-out battle, and call it a day. No. Actually, we're not doing that. At least not yet. There is definitely a place to explore the realm of death and the whole jailer storyline in Warcraft's timeline, but I don't think immediately after Battle for Azeroth is the place to do it. Remember, we've been systematically dismantling the whole Sylvanas jailer storyline up to this point, and that's because, well, honestly, I don't think there's any salvaging it. It's just bad, and there was no build-up to it, at least none that we could see as players, so we're skipping right over this for now. But, you might ask, where are we going instead? I like the overall idea Blizzard has with exploring the cosmic chart after defeating the Burning Legion. We as players of course fall under the realm of order, and the demons of the realm of disorder have always been a big bad for us to chase after. However, the old gods and beings of the void have always been a less immediate threat to us. Of course, we just dealt with N'Zoth, so what happens next? Well, we have been privy to the existence of the Void Lords at the top of the realm of the Void for a little while now, but we also want to keep Azeroth central to the plot as much as possible, lessons we've learned from both Warlords and now Shadowlands, so let's have the Void come to us. The pre-expansion build-up could be something along the lines of working with Wrathion to strengthen the prisons of Cthulhu and Yogg-Saron, all the while lesser minions of the Void Lords are popping up all around the world trying to stop us. From there, giant holes to the underworld open up where the old god's minions have holed up for eons. I figure it'd have an aesthetic similar to the Nerubians from Wrath, with a marginally higher concentration of tentacles this time. As for the actual story premise, I don't really know. I'm just making it up as I go along now, so I'll avoid any specific details as much as possible. At this point, I'm just throwing around the general concepts that feel like they'd fit into the flow of the established timeline. After we face the Void Lords and beat them back from Azeroth, it only makes sense to move on to the Light. Now, while the Light is mostly friendly to us as a people, we saw brief glimpses in Legion of its darker side. The Prime Naru Zera tried to force Illidan to turn to the Light, which didn't work out too well for it, but it did do a great job in showing us the more vindictive side of the Light. Remember that we are beings of the realm of order, and while we often align with the Light and its ideals, that's not always the case. Okay, this time for real. But if we're not doing the whole Sylvanas jailer thing, how do we get to the Shadowlands? I think this is a lot more simple than it may appear. Zovaal the jailer is trying to break free of the Maw after being imprisoned there for thousands upon thousands of years. Azeroth is being attacked by the undead, and Bolvar Fordragon, as the current Lich King, is having trouble controlling the undead scourge. We learn that Kil'jaeden had studied the Realm of Death in the domination magic used by Zovaal when creating the Lich King. This means that Zovaal wouldn't actually have had any hand in these events himself, but he does know how this magic works, and how to manipulate it. I also think it would be cool to have the higher ranking Scourge still under Bolvar's control because they're strong enough to resist the Jailer's magic, so you have this battle between the mindless hordes going ballistic and the Scourge officers who are on our side, similar to the Death Knights of the Ebonblade. From there, Bolvar works with various mages of Azeroth to open a portal directly to the Shadowlands. We're expecting to land straight in the Maw, but instead we find ourselves in Oribos. We discover that the Maw isn't the only portion of the afterlife, and we work together to gain the trust of the various Paragons of Death in our fight against the Jailer. The main storyline quests of the original Shadowlands zones can remain the same for the most part. I honestly like where they took us. It was just the overarching story of the expansion that missed the mark. So what's the new story with the Jailer then? I'd say we skipped the entire plot that's been teased recently with the Paragons being robots created by these first ones. That's literally just a rehashing of the Titans and their keepers on Azeroth. Instead, they're all actual people, not robots, and the first ones don't exist. As for Zovaal, I actually do like the idea that he was once the Arbiter, and the Paragons created a robot to act as the new Arbiter. This is the one robot we're allowing. I think it would make more sense that Zovaal, as the former Arbiter, became disillusioned by viewing countless tragedies from the perspective of those that lived through them. Remember that the Arbiter has to view every memory from everyone that dies in order to send them to the right realm of the Shadowlands. Just take a moment to think about all the wars and gruesome events that have happened on just Azeroth. The burning of Teldrassil, the battle for Undercity, the siege of Orgrimmar, the bombing of Theramore, just to name a few of the most recent ones. And that's not even counting the great wars from the old Warcraft games or the War of the Ancients. I'm sure you can think of plenty others. So now multiply that by 1 billion fold for every civilization that's ever existed in the Warcraft universe. Imagine the horrors Zovaal would have witnessed and how that would wear down anyone's resolve. I feel like any sane person would crack in that kind of environment and would want to unmake the universe that allowed such atrocities to unfold. No one is meant to witness that kind of suffering on even a fraction of that scale. And honestly, I think this would have been a pretty decent direction to take the Jailer. At least we're going through a lot less mental gymnastics this way. Anyways, as for Sylvanas' part in this expansion, I think she can have a decently large part, but I don't think we need her to go crazy flip-flopping allegiances 24/7. I think she can struggle with her undeath and the false promises of Zovaal, but I don't think she should go as far as to do his bidding, just enough to leave us wondering if she's actually going to turn, and then at the final hour during the Zovaal raid fight, Sylvanas can take the final blow. From there, you could explore the realm of life and have the enemy be something like the Emerald Nightmare. Obviously, we could help Elune and explore that whole side of the story, but by this point I'm kind of exhausting any information I had left to go on. Of course, you can always throw in a random expansion here and there to explore the faction war further, because there's obviously a limit to how much we can explore the cosmic chart before we reach an endpoint there. The possibilities are practically endless, and it's really just a matter of the context of what feels most natural in the pre-established flow compared to what came before. Believe it or not, I didn't make this video to just rag on Shadowlands' story. There's definitely valid criticism to be had, but honestly, this video concept just kind of started as a fun thought experiment for me, and I just ran with it from there. I'm not really a fan of the current direction of the story, so I wanted to give a few examples of how we could get to a different endpoint with basically the same pieces. There's definitely a ton of other plot threads I didn't touch on because I couldn't fit them cleanly into this script. The whole Night Warrior thing comes to mind. Either way, I do have a lot of sympathy for the writers at Blizzard. This is going to be one hell of a hole to dig yourself out of, and I think I speak for a lot of the fans when I say we wish you the best of luck in correcting your course. Despite the vitriol on the forums and Twitter, I would dare to say that a huge majority would like to see WoW be successful again. As consumers, we only lose if the game fails, and I do really hope you're not too jaded to listen to the feedback by this point. But anyways, I think I'm going to end it there before I ramble on any longer. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you wanna, and until next time, don't die.